Today's date is January 23rd, 2018. The topic tonight is Forgotten Bones, Abandoned Cemeteries in Evansville by Dennis Au. We're at Willard Library, Evansville, Indiana, in the Browning Gallery. He will speak about Evansville's several forgotten cemeteries, the earliest date back to Evansville founding, and the newest burial plot that was still active during the Second World War. These forgotten plots are a mix of pioneer religious, municipal, and institutional areas. Dennis is a professional historian, folklorist, preservationist. Before his retirement in 2016, he served as the Evansville Preservation Officer for 19 years, and he now continues to research and write in pursuing his lifelong interest in archaeology. This will be Dennis Au.
Director of Willard Library, he's a co-sponsor and provides us this room for free. Greg is on our board of directors. Dennis Au is our speaker tonight. He's on our board of directors. He's back when I see in the room. He's on our board of directors. We're a small organization dedicated to preserving and spreading the history of Vanderbilt County. Because it's the bicentennial year, we have some other things coming up soon. In conjunction with the museum, we're going to have, the museum is going to have its own 2-month display on the bicentennial. We're going to have a speaker talking about Henry Vanderbilt and who he was, no holds barred. A speaker about courthouses Vanderbilt County's past. And we're going to have a presentation about, we're going to have a walking tour of downtown Evansville, county specific. Then we're going to have sometime in fall, let's call it a historic tavern tour. Pub crawl if you want. I'm going to hit the outer townships that aren't normally considered, we're South Evansville Century, and we'll do that, I hope by Gus, and that'll be sometime early fall. More things to come. So, tonight it's, are you going to hit the Nesbitt? We're going to hit the Nesbitt. Nesbitt, probably St. Joe, probably Funkhouse, possibly Horse Cutters. Speaking ahead of time, we have not talked to the barn owner yet. We must do that first. They'll have certain ideas. Okay, so, there's a sign-out sheet out front for the Vanderbilt County Historic Society. If you would like to get on our mailing list, please do that and ask for me to email and I send out those things. And somewhere in the room, there's somebody who feels like you should be a member, but you're not, for $20. And so if you got that guilt on you, there's some forms out there, and you get some other ones, so you just raise your hand and I'll get you a form. And Larry Bristol so kindly said he's going to request his house for this. So nice. So let's do tonight's program. Dennis Au is a professional historian, folklorist, and preservationist. Before his retirement in 2016, he had been Evansville Historic Preservation Officer for 19 years. His publications include pieces on the War of 1812, Foodways, and historic architecture. Most recently, Dennis is proud of his role in discovering the national significance of the Peters Marketing House at the University of Evansville right now. In his retirement, Al continues to research and write and is pursuing his lifelong interest in archaeology. Tonight is Forgotten Bones, Evansville's Abandoned Cemeteries. And Dennis, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
In the nearly 20 years that I was Evansville's Historic Preservation Officer, every now and then information about abandoned or old cemeteries would cross my desk. And I started informally collecting these in a file. And the file, by the time I retired, was easily that thick. And what I would do with the information, because I thought it was important, it wasn't exactly the center of my job. As soon as I had enough information, I registered these old cemeteries with the Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology in Indianapolis. That gave them some official status. Does that guarantee their preservation? No. But at least they have official status for what's called the Section 106 process. That's federal paperwork. But it still is important. And that everybody asks me about these cemeteries, so I will deal with this question immediately. And when they say, oh yes, when the Evansville graveyard ceased to have interments after 1860, of course they moved the bodies. I know they moved some stones. One would hope that they moved the bones connected to the stones, but there's no guarantee. And for example, that cemetery, there was quite a section dedicated for the burial of the indigent. Did they move those people? Still part of the human family. And there were many infant deaths at that time. Did they move the infants? Probably not. Infant remains are difficult to find after those conditions being in the ground for 30 or 40 years. So we still have bones scattered in the city of Evansville, and I'm going to talk about 7 cemeteries. There are more out there too, and I'm sure there are dozens of people out in the audience who know of other cemeteries. But the first one I'm going to talk about is the Mcgarry burial ground. And thanks to my friend Stan Schmidt, supposedly this works. When all else fails, find the arrow key. I'm jinxed. And let me just use my voice for a few minutes. This cemetery, I started to compile information thanks to Stan Schmidt, the official county historian. And he gave me newspaper articles about finding bones near the intersection of Northwest 4th and Vine Street. And this is one of the most interesting cemeteries in Vanderburgh County. Is it working, Terry?
Not yet. I've got Greg Major back here. He knows all that. Okay. Well, we'll do it this way. When you just have sometimes fun, and that's what I'm doing. This cemetery, through about a 60-decade period, whenever there was construction in this area, they would find bones. For example, when they put the brick in the streets in the late 19th century, as they were digging the base out for the bricks, they encountered human interments. When in 1908 they were digging the foundation for the court building, guess what they found? More human remains. Now, we're not talking about finding them and then having these bones carefully exhumed. No, the people thought, gosh, these we didn't expect these. It must be Native Americans. Nah, maybe yes, maybe no. Probably no. And when they were putting in the gas lines and sewer lines there near this intersection, guess what they found? More human internments. But the story deepens, actually, and gets more interesting. In 1931, there's some articles in the newspaper. And these articles
mention that 3 or 4 decades previous, a descendant of Hugh Mcgarry Jr., the founder of Evansville, a descendant wrote back and asked about the burial place of their mother, Mary Mcgarry, and gave a rather detailed description. The description was given to one of the local abstractors, and the abstractor pinpointed the location.
It's not ideal, but you can do for the site and under that way.
No?
Okay, we'll go right. Aha.
Which one do you want on?
Does it work, or
Well, we pick a site now.
oh, okay. Let's start with this one right here. Excavators. This is from when they were putting up the court building. When it was built, it was the furniture building. Okay. Indian bones are dug up by laborers, and again they were put on display in hose house number 2. Well, what kind of respect do you get? Now, the next one. Then in 1931, there was a story in the newspaper about the wife of Hugh Mcgarry, the founder and the first settler in Evansville. And as I said, and through the help of an abstractor here, the descendants learned exactly where this was. There are ghosts about here.
It should be working.
It should be working? Okay. And they said that the burial was beneath this church. This is the German Methodist Church. How many of you remember the German Methodist Church in town? Sounds like a combination or contradiction in terms, German and Methodist, but there was a synod. And you can tell right where it is. There's the old jail, and there's the courthouse. But they said Mrs. Hugh Mcgarry Jr.'s buried somewhere under the church. They didn't excavate the church completely. You can see one floor is here. There's another. And after this article, the maintenance man from this church came forward and said, oh yeah, about 1890, I had to do some work in the basement there. And I came across a skeleton, and she had bright red hair. And from the description, there's some, if you stretch the truth and in the evidence a little bit, some reason to believe that he ran into the remains of Mrs. Hugh Mcgarry Jr. And be careful to say Mr. Hugh Mcgarry Jr. Hugh Mcgarry was convicted of murder. He had killed an unarmed Indian. Anyway, if you want to know exactly where this location is, right here. How many of you have gone into the parking lot right there? Well, you drove over the remains of Mrs. Hugh Mcgarry Jr. But here's an aerial photograph that I took. You can see the various evidence. When the court building was erected in 1908, they found human remains during the construction of the street right here for bricking. They found human remains. Bratt and Fuller's History of Vanderbilt County mentioned that there were that this was the cemetery. 4 skeletons were found when the service pipes were buried there. So I've never found a map of it, although in 1821, the Vanderbilt County Commissioners paid a surveyor $1 to drop a map, And he marked in his survey notes that in the center of the cemetery, right in the center, was the tombstone of Mrs. Hugh Mcgarry Jr., and he measured a 1 square acre based upon, and the marker was that tombstone. Anybody know where that tombstone was? So we don't have map evidence, but you can see there's plenty of other evidence. So I put some boundaries on it when I registered this cemetery with the state of Indiana. And that's about where it is. Now, who's buried there? We don't know much. We know that Mrs. Hugh Mcgarry Jr. is there and 2 of his young children. There was a lot of infant death in the past. Were the bodies moved? Obviously, many of them were not. There's one candidate, though, at Oak Hill Cemetery for a stone that could have been could have come from this cemetery. Somehow. Well, anyway, it's a stone of Elizabeth Harrison. It's from 1818. One of the most beautiful stones in the entire cemetery. It's just like the stones you find in New England. And it's a beautiful piece of folk art. In fact, it's not only the headstone, but it also has a footstone. At that time, many interments had footstones. Now, the next cemetery is the Evansville graveyard. Once again, or one of the things that have in the past has brought my attention to these cemeteries is the 1880 Atlas of Vanderburgh County. You see here, there's Canal Street. This is Southeast 4th Street, 5th Street, 6th Street. This is Chandler. This is Gum. You think, wait, that's right downtown too. Well, this cemetery dates from 1823 when Robert and Jane Evans donated a piece of land, just over an acre square, to be used forever and without disturbing as a cemetery. Well, that piece of language and that deed didn't mean much, as you can see. And in fact, Robert and Jane Evans were buried there. There's good documentation on the cemetery in the recorder's office. You can see the center square there and all of these numbered graves that people could purchase. And down here on the west side and on the east side, there's quite a substantial area represented the Potter's Field. Do you know what Potter's Field means? It's a term that comes actually from the Passion story of Christ. That means it's just a place for the burial of the indigent. It's a free place to bury people. And you can see there's another document that even has names on it of people who purchased the land, the plots there. Were they actually buried there? Not known. Well, in 1853, Oak Hill Cemetery opens up. Whoops. There's a picture of the cemetery from the 1856 bird's eye view of Evansville. This little creek right there is actually the Wabash and Erie Canal. This is Canal Street. This is Wheeler School. This is Mulberry Street. And this would be 5th Street, Southeast 4th Street, to orient yourself on that one. But in 1881, the city decides, you know, you can't get through Mulberry Street there. So how about if we just put the road through because, hey, the main cemetery now is at Oak Hill. Well, the Evansville Courier decides to put up a protest. And at the top there it says, cheek and ignorance. They're going to stir up a hornet's nest here. And basically they said, look, you're putting this cemetery right through a cemetery. Bodies haven't been moved yet. Well, and it's right here on Mulberry Street. How many of you have driven that stretch of street? Well, that's where it is. And in fact, what came from this effort a few days later, there was quite a history of the cemetery that appeared in the newspaper. Well, from what, in following through the newspaper, they did move some bodies, and they did move some stones. How many bodies? The story will get thicker in a few minutes. Among the bodies, this is General Robert Evans, his wife Jane. That's at Oak Hill Cemetery now. Here's another miscellaneous stone that obviously it's not an original interment at Oak Hill Cemetery. The fellow died in 1848, and they didn't start burying people until 1853. I love epitaphs. An affectionate husband, a kind father, and a faithful friend. So, too bad we don't put epitaphs on things. So, the road goes through. We drive over today. Then, in 1896, somebody decides there's money to be made. So they plat the area of the cemetery. You can see the square right there. And they have the cheek to call it the subdivision of the old cemetery. Wow. There's still people living there. Okay. There is the approximate bounds. This is a map I put together for the State Archaeologist's Office. Here you can see Mulberry Street in the checked area, the striped area. Here is the area of the cemetery. You can see Mulberry Street. And right in here there's is quite a bit of development and then redevelopment. Over here is a nursing home now. And see it. Somehow we're skipping things. But anyway, but I can tell the story without this slide. In 1969, in this area, they decide to build a mental health center. Now it's the Southwest Indiana Mental Health Center, and it's named after Mr. Spear. And as they're digging there, the drag line latches onto something and partially crushes what they think is an old metal pipe. They thought, oh, it's a sewer pipe. Well, they go down there, and it's a cast iron coffin. And the lady inside was practically in perfect condition. Not dressed, hair parted in the middle. Didn't take long though before, since air is now into this thing, before things, there's a necessity to do something quick. And the body was put into a coffin and buried at county expense at Oak Hill Cemetery. There's speculation that, oh, this is Mrs. Hugh Mcgarry Jr., A lot of misinformation floating out there. But no, woman of some means to have a cast iron coffin. And after this, though, they thought, oh, I guess we need to pay attention, as we're thinking. They found 2 more jaws, and then they found another complete internment. How much care they took with this material, I don't know. But that is that location, the Evansville graveyard, and certainly many of the pioneers of Evansville were there. In fact, another thing they found there was a part of a tombstone. The next cemetery. Again, I love maps. I'm a map geek. So, right here, it says Cemetery. This is the 1880 Atlas. Right here is Jefferson Avenue. This is Madison. Up here, I believe, is Washington. And I thought, what cemetery is right here? That's all developed. So I started to look into this more closely. And thank goodness, I always am proud to give my predecessor, Joan Marchand, credit. She had a file on it. And Joan was always thorough. She always made me look good. And she was an enjoyable person. But as I dug deeper, I found these plaques in the recorder's office. And here we go again, is Blackford's Grove. So Washington Avenue is right there. And it ends right there. Here's Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and the Jewish burial ground. The street doesn't go through here yet. This will be Governor Street. This is 1871. There's another one in 1872. Then, about 1876, the city decides to actually put Governor Street through, and they have to do something about the Jewish cemetery. What are we going to do? So, they buy it from the Jewish temple, and they move something. They move stones, and here are some of the stones that were moved. You can see the stones there, all lined up against the wall. That wall on the other side of the wall is the Evansville Country Club. There's certainly not enough room for a full extended burial. So, don't know. And the stones are really interesting because almost all of these, there's a great deal of Hebrew content. This right here is from 1867. Again, a young female dies. Lots of sad stories in cemeteries. Lots of sad stories. But here again, I plotted very carefully. And thank goodness for those plats, because they were very careful about measurements on the plats. Up here is Jefferson. This is Madison. This is Governor. You get the idea where it is. And guess what? There's a church there now, ironically. And when they started construction on this church in 1910, it didn't take them long for them to run into two bodies. Then as 1911 comes, they find 3 or 4 more. And so that's the story of the Jewish cemetery. We seem to be, do not discriminate against, or any religious faith will desecrate. But at least the stones are moved, and I hope more of the bodies. But I registered this because, with the saint, because there's every likelihood that there are more interments, or at least miscellaneous bones scattered around. Sometimes one finds miscellaneous bones. Okay, the next cemetery. This is Jimtown. Everybody knows where Jimtown is. This is North Garden. This is Virginia, I believe, and this is Columbia. Well, the first Catholic cemetery, according to the 1880 Atlas, is right in the neighborhood of St. Joseph's Catholic Church. And my guess it was in use from about the 1840s to the 1850s. Started from the 1840s and 50s, and it was in use until the mid-1880s. But by the time 1916 comes around, I think somebody was itching to sell some of the property for money because people hadn't been buried there for 30 years. So the church decides to sell the land. Right here, this is a good map showing this: Columbia, Garden, Virginia, Michigan. Here's St. Joe's Church. The 1880 map shows burials. This is cemetery, and this is cemetery. But in 1916, they start exhuming the burials. They say they're going to sell lots, and in fact, this area was platted for housing. You can see there it is. The burials were moved to the modern St. Joseph Cemetery in the west side. And they seem to be more systematic and concerned about this. And that's no huge surprise. One of the tenets of Catholic faith is that this is sacred ground, Campo Santo. And they do, considering their belief in the resurrection of the dead, they try to respect this. And to some degree, I do believe they did. Doesn't always happen. Some of my early French ancestors in Michigan, their cemetery from 1788 to 1820, in the 1890s, the bishop sells it to somebody. And it was almost developed into a subdivision until I raised a flag saying, there are people here. But anyway, there it is. And as they're digging, they find a few people buried in steel caskets. And it makes the newspaper. And yes, you can see another article, Workman Gaze that features buried a half century ago. There's another burial that they find. There's a window in the casket. Oh, wow. And here's some of the stones at St. Joseph's Cemetery. Now this is on the far, it's on the edge of the cemetery, up the hill on the far north edge. This is for Barbara, wife of Joseph Woods. But you can tell something's different about this collection of stones, and it's more of a scattering. There you can see it going down the road. But there's a good chance that there are bones associated with those. Are there any bones left in the old St. Joseph Cemetery? I guess, again, they didn't have archaeologists digging them up, so they weren't quite as careful. So miscellaneous vertebrae, ribs, other things are probably there. And did they miss some interments? You betcha. So, and I would like to think that in the northern half of the original cemetery, the church did not develop this, hopefully out of respect for whoever might still be there. And it's still open land if you're driving by and you notice what's going on here. There's nothing on this land, and I think it's a good thing. And there it is. This is what it looks like. You see it's open. This is looking north from the back of St. Joseph, the old St. Joseph School. This is looking toward the church. See the church right there. Nice open areas. Now, the next one is the State Hospital Potter's Field. And it's one that is dear to my heart. I did quite a bit of research here. I registered the area with a state archaeologist. And again, as with Evansville's first cemetery, I could find no map pinpointing this. But it was in the corner, in the southeast corner of the State Hospital property, right at the corner of Van and Slaughters Avenue. People remember Slaughters Avenue? And it's roughly the Lloyd Expressway. Here's a photograph showing where it was. This is the Lloyd Expressway. Slaughters Avenue actually was over here. So, and the interments were right in this general area. And you know what makes me sad? The people here did not get any respect in life. They were basically warehoused at the State Hospital, and nor did they get any respect in death. They were put in plain boxes and buried in a row, one after the other, depending on who died. And these were the people that the next of kin did not come and claim the body. And among them, too, there was a period in the 1920s when the state used these bodies for medical education. They were shipped to Bloomington for use as cadavers for the medical students. Anyway, that's where they were. And in about 1983, as they were building the Lloyd Expressway, somebody said, oops, somebody tells me that there might be a cemetery here. And they don't hire archaeologists, but there's this old fellow living somewhere near Petersburg who has a lot of experience digging graves in the county up there. They hired him to dig up the graves. Documentation is somewhat minimal, but they find right where the Lloyd Expressway is they find about 70 interments, human interments. And they move the bones in mass to Sunset Memorial Park, and there's a small stone there marking these. Now, do we know who any of these graves belong to? If there were records, my guess, and my feeling there probably were some minimal records, and they were kept at the state hospital there. But there was a catastrophic fire there during the Second World War, and my guess is that these records were burned in. However, I keep looking, and you take these kinds of mysteries and you put them in your back pocket, and someday you still might find it, and hope that others will take an interest. Now, thank goodness, in 2012, when the city had plans for this pedestrian overpass over the Lloyd, that in doing the Section 106 review, that's something, remember, it's federal paperwork, and in doing this review, the material I sent out to Indianapolis came to light. Oops, we can't just start digging here. We need to take some care. And they hired an archaeological firm in Evansville. Anybody here realize that we have a firm in Evansville that does archaeology? Section 106. It's cultural resource analysts. And their office is in, appropriately, the old courthouse. And they were hired, and they started their search by using ground-penetrating radar. This is, instead of shooting the radar up in the sky to see where the airplanes are, it shoots it down into the ground. And you can get some idea, some clues, as to where there is disturbed earth. And in their survey, they noticed, there's a disturbed piece of earth here, and 2 foot away, there's another disturbed piece. 4 foot away, there's another. 6 foot away, there's another, all in a row. What might that be? Well, there was enough evidence for them to do excavation before they built this. Again, out of respect for the people who are buried there. And the excavation was very systematic, and they did find 8 human internments. And they salvaged, or they recovered, every scrap that was associated with these burials. Again, they found out that they were buried in rather rudimentary wood coffins, but they were buried in order, as if there was a map, and they knew where to put people one after another. And after recovering all of these remains, including remains of coffins, these remains were properly boxed, and they were taken to Oak Hill Cemetery, and with the attendance of the chaplain from the state hospital, they were reinterred with some dignity. Finally, they get a little modicum of dignity, and a marker was put there in memory of those buried there, and in memory of the others buried in this cemetery. And it's my hope that someday, like there are more people buried here for sure, and even toward the expressway and almost into the ditch alongside it. My hope is that this not be forgotten, in that, this area deserves a historical marker, just to remind people of this. It's worthwhile marking. It's an important story in the history of Evansville, Vanderburgh County, but it needs some kind of marking. The next one is a little cemetery, Droll's Cemetery. Anybody here ever hear of Droll's Cemetery? Well, it surprised me too. It's located, here's an aerial I did, Upper Mount Vernon Road right here. And this is New Harmony Way. This is just to the west. And right here is the area where it is. There's an apartment complex there. And there is a self-storage here now. And when I first found out this, my wife and I were renting a storage space here. I could see it. And I walked this area, and about right here, there was still a base of a tombstone. That has since disappeared, which is too bad. It was a physical reminder that it was there. But in doing research, I discovered that this little droll cemetery, starting in 1931, was part of a court case. The Droll family sold this property, and they were concerned that the graves of their ancestors would be disturbed. So they tried to get a court order, or they went to court, to have this area delineated as a cemetery. Well, the case went on for a while, but in 1939 the court finally agreed, and this map was drawn up. You can see there's Upper Mount Vernon Road, and you can see the dimensions of it. As I said, in my memory, in the late 1990s, there's still a tombstone base there. The apartment complex people here use this as a picnic ground. Well, it's okay to use a cemetery like that as a picnic ground. I don't consider that disrespectful. But I only hope that nothing happens to it. In fact, in my years when I worked in the Civic Center, I wanted to knock on the property owner's door and say, are you paying taxes on this land? And if they were, I would say, you know what? By Indiana law, and with the evidence I had in hand, you can show the county assessor that this is a cemetery, so designated by the court. And the state does not tax cemeteries. Anyway, there are many more. There's a picture of it. There's the apartment complex. Rolls Avenue is right back here. It's this area right here. It is orphaned, but should not be forgotten. There are other cemeteries around too, and I'm just going to briefly talk about one. This is in fact behind the Aldi's on the west side. Back about a quarter of a mile back, you know, there's that housing development back there from the 1920s to the 1970s. Well, a fellow who lived on Bossy Street, there's Bossy Street back there, and gave me the photograph. He said, behind my house in some empty lots, there are a couple tombstones. Elder Tate. Here's another, Willard, 1909 to 1931, I believe. And could I ever find out anything about that cemetery? No. Things got rather busy for me doing architecture at the Civic Center. But I would hope that someday someone would take a little interest here, document it, and I would help make sure the document goes to the state so it's officially designated as a cemetery. Of course, I don't know if somebody just had sample tombstones and put them there. I have no idea. But there are other cemeteries, and I couldn't mention them all. For example, there's the Stinson Cemetery it's I think Dixie Flyer going out toward Dogtown. There are, of course, the Modern Day Cemetery, which was Perry Township Cemetery on New Harmony Way. There are others, and I'm sure you folks know of others. But if I want to say one thing, I was so thrilled to do this presentation because I think it's so important that people know where these cemeteries are. It's the first step in according these cemeteries and the people buried in them proper respect. And I'm happy to report that the DAR is in the midst of putting up a historical marker in the Mcgarry burial place. And this is a part of the bicentennial celebration for Vanderbilt County. So we'll have a nice marker there that will document the existence of that. So hopefully it's not so easily forgotten. These things are easily forgotten. You think, no, that can't be. It happens. So if you take anything away from this, please remember these places. If you come up with your own, they can be documented. And if somebody, for example, wants to figure out what this is about, I can give them information. That's basically my talk on Forgotten Bones. And again, I hope you'll take an interest in these areas. Please don't forget them. It's our ancestors are counting and remembering. Thank you.
We have questions for Dennis. Yes.
Well, some of the graveyards, obviously not the Potter's Fields, but some of the earlier graveyards that were paved over for construction or whatever, did they ever try to